Hey everybody, gonna put together a little video for chapter 19 in the Intro to Game Design, Prototyping, and Development book, just so you have something to refer back to. I'm hopefully not gonna make this a very long video, but I do want you to have something to correspond with the work in the class. So, without further ado, I'm going to switch over to my screen and you should now see the chapter on the screen. And what he has in here is a standard project setup procedure. And what I'd recommend is following this so that you can make sure that your setup is taken care of. So I'm going to click over to Appendix A. And the screens are a little bit different than what you might experience in Unity. You had some various updates and that sort of thing. So if you're using Unity Hub, this is where you'll set up you would set up a new project, and I'll take you through this in a second. Um, but you really do want to keep an eye on where you're saving things. You want to make sure that your size and your settings are all according to what he says here. We want to do things very simply. We want to make sure that we have C# scripts available to us and everything. And so we're going to go through a couple of these steps as we move forward in the book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just make sure that we know that we can go back to this Appendix A at any time. And so that's tip number one. Make sure that you refer to Appendix A. Tip number two is going to come straight from chapter 19, which is the Hello World, your first program chapter. And we will use the project name Hello World, scene name, and C# script names. Sorry. And we'll create the scene in C# scripts as part of the chapter. So what I am going to do is I'm going to hit pause real quick so that I can get my screen set up the way I need to in Unity. And what you'll have noticed is that just the screen has changed right here. So what I want to do is I want to create a new project. I'm going to click on this drop down, and it gives me the choice between 2019 and 2018 right here. And so if you're not seeing these choices, just as a side note, you're going to want to go to your installs and make sure that these versions of Unity are available. So I'm going to use 2018.4.30F1 as my installation for this project. So I'm going to go to New, and I'll select 2018.4.30. And I'm going to set up a brand new 3D project, although that's not going to matter for this particular item. And I'm going to say that this is called Hello World. And I'm going to make sure that my location is someplace where I know I'm going to go back in and grab all of my Unity projects. So this is going to be my Unity projects folder. And the Unity projects folder, if you take a look at where I have this located, it's in my WMONER folder on my desktop. You could keep yours in your documents or something like that. I don't recommend placing things like this on the desktop though, because that's probably it's going to get very overwhelming very quickly for you. So I have this stored under Unity projects. I'm going to click select folder, and then I'll click create, and we are off. So that's step two. Okay, and so what I've received is an error message whenever I started this up that there's a new version of the Unity editor available for download. And you want to look closely whenever you get these messages. Currently installed version is 2018.4.30F1, and the new version is .31F1. Now, I don't think there will be any problems if we install the new version, but for purposes of our class and for this session, I'm not going to do this upgrade, but I want to be full disclosure. As soon as Unity is done churning and you get a message like this, we'll just you need to address it. So I'm going to click skip new version for now. Right. And so what I want to do next is to get set up for the lesson about starting the Hello World. So I'll do a little switch over here to take a look at where we are in the book. I will note that in my version of Unity, I have created, based on what he advised in chapter 18, under layout, I created a game dev layout here, and that layout looks like this. So if you haven't done this already, no big deal. Just go ahead in and create a layout that looks like this, where you have the project window, the hierarchy window, the scene, the game, the console, and the inspector all laid out like this. And then once you have this layout in place, by dragging the panels around, you click on Save Layout and name it with a space in front of it and then Game Dev. And that way it always sits at the top of the screen. Okay. So, so far so good. We're in to Unity. We have our scene set up the way that it needs to be, and we'll continue forward. All right, step 3 is we're going to follow his instructions in the chapter. And in the chapter, you'll see it says selecting Reveal in Finder opens a Finder window showing you the contents of your project folder. And this is where I want to reemphasize that it's important to make sure that all of your projects are in the right place on your computer. So I'm on a Mac, and what I want to do here is I'm going to switch my view so that I can see the full view of all of my files in their proper locations. And so in my W Moner folder, I have Unity projects, and then I have Hello World, and there are assets in here, and there are scenes that go along with my assets. You'll also see folders for library, logs, packages, project settings, and temp, and all of these folders should be there for all of your projects. Don't modify things as in terms of what the folder structure looks like. You shouldn't have to work with the file system too much, if at all. All right. So I'm going to close that back out and wanted to illustrate what he was talking about in the chapter there. Okay, so the next step will be to make sure that we're working in the right space here. And what he mentions in the chapter about working in the project is that the assets folder is going to appear here and holds everything that appears in the project pane inside of Unity. So I'm going to switch back into Unity. I'm going to click Reveal in Finder, and we can see that the assets folder has all of our scenes and that sort of thing. There's also a packages folder, and this packages folder has more information about what our scenes might look like. And for now, I just want to reassert what he is saying in his chapter, where you could potentially use the assets folder on the project pane interchangeably, but he says he highly recommends working exclusively with the project pane rather than the assets folder. So when you're working in Unity, you'll want to make sure that you're working on adding or creating new items within this this assets pane inside of the interface. Okay. So now I have switched to this making a new C# script channel, or it's a channel. Goodness, I'm going to switch to this new portion of the chapter, and so we're going to follow these steps along very in a very 1, 2, 3 sort of manner, and in C#, we're going to be using Visual Studio instead of this mono develop environment. It's going to look fairly identical. I checked in with the author. He said he hasn't seen any problems with this in conjunction with his book, but author's perspective being what it is, he doesn't see things from our perspective, so there might be some changes that need to happen. At any rate, what we're going to do is we're going to click the Create button in the project pane and choose Create C# Script. So I'm going to go into here, and this tiny little button that says Create up here, I'm going to click on C# Script, and when I get this coming up, I'm going to get a new behavior script, and it's going to drop right into my assets folder. And what I want to do here is name the script Hello World, all one word, no spaces, a camel case sort of scenario. We're going to have the HB capitalized though. And so right here, I'm going to call this Hello World, and then I hit enter, and Then I will double click the name or the icon of the Hello World script in the project plane to open Visual Studio. Okay. That'll take a second, so I'm going to hit pause, and then you'll magically see it appear in a moment. Now, for a very brief moment with yours, you may have seen a prompt come up that shows the opening window for Visual Studio, and it will ask you if you want a new project or to open a project, and just don't click that. Right? Just let it go because it will open up this interface and allows you to see what the code looks like here. And I have inadvertently put a little dot in front of my code here. Did not mean to do that. And so we'll see what ends up happening. I think I hit the dot. The dot also is my trigger on OBS, which is the recording studio, to hit pause and unpause. So I'm wondering if using a text editor is going to be odd with that. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so this is what our script looks like. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit more detail than what he tends to go into in the book, just because, it's a class and I'm trying to share my knowledge. So what you end up seeing here first is what this interface looks like. I find this terribly hard to read at such a tiny little size. So what I'm going to do first off is go into Visual Studio. I'm going to get to my preferences here. And inside my preferences, I'm going to find the fonts button, and it has a text editor Menlo regular 12. And what I want to do is I'm going to bump up the code editor size. I'm going to make it larger than what you need, just so you can see the code on the video. So I'm going to go to 24, but I usually put this around 14 point, and that allows me to see things a lot more clearly. Okay, so I select the fonts, and then now I'm Menlo regular 24. I might bump these up as necessary, but now you can see the code much better. I can see the code much better. Everybody's happy. And the reason why I suggest that, especially for first-time coders, is that there's a lot of this stuff. Semicolons and colons and parentheses and squiggly lines and all that stuff. And I really want you to see this stuff, especially early on. Okay? So once we have this in place, you'll see two areas that you'll need to be really concerned about here. And I'm going to use code comments to show you what's happening in this space. So I'm going to put in a code comment, and this is to set up our code environment on first run. So in the start area, you're going to load up a whole bunch of information in this space that you're going to use throughout your project. But when you are in a game environment, you also have a function called update. And update runs every time a frame is updated, or it's called once per frame, right? So what that means is that when we're playing a video game, we want things to run at 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second or whatever that might be. So every time the frame updates from still frame to still frame to still frame, this code is going to run, okay? And so what this really enables is anything that has motion, anything that needs to update a score, to catch a collision between two objects in our code, whatever that might be, all of that stuff is going to happen in the update code rather than in the start code. So we're responding to things in the update area that a user has done within our interface. Okay, so for now, just know that these two sections are always going to be part of our code in here. And I'm going to move these comments up just so they're out of the way. And I'll put these up where the other comments are. Okay. Now, if you're familiar with video editing or animation or anything like that, then you will know that each frame updates as you move things. But the thing about coding for video games is that it has to be dynamic. So whatever the user's input is, you have to respond in kind with something that will output to reward them, or at least show that you've recognized their output or input. I'm sorry. Now he talks about the difference between start and update in this chapter, so you should be able to get some good background on that. But what he has asked us to do in the book is to add a little print statement that says that this is going to actually fire, and you'll see how things are connected in here. So in our start area right here, we're going to take this line print hello world, and I prefer you not to copy things out of a textbook area and into your code, just because sometimes there's like really invisible characters, like goofy little things about type formatting on the printed page. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go to line 11 and I'm going to type in print and then quote hello world. And what you'll notice is that your code will highlight, and you'll see some hinting coming up. You'll see lots of things happening in this interface, and we'll talk about those whenever we get a chance to see them. But for now, all we want to do is save this as our asset, and now we have this hello world.cs. This stands for C# script, and we have a start area with print hello world. And just notice that I want to make sure that I have a semicolon after every line, and that anytime I'm working inside what's called a function, I'm going to have a starting and an ending curly brace in here. Okay. So once I've done that, I go back over into my Unity screen, and then I have this C# asset here. And what I want to do is drag that over into our main camera. And what that does is it yells at me and says that it can't do that. Okay? So I'm going to figure out why that just did that, and I'll be back in one quick second. And I've found the error. The error is that in my public class, because I didn't save this right away, and this is something that I need you to see now, so I'm glad we caught it at the very beginning. This is kind of a common thing in Unity, especially if you're working with scripting. Is that you need to make sure that your public class is matched to the same name as this, where it should be hello world. Okay, so my public class is named hello world. I save that. It is linked up to mono behavior, which is part of the Unity engine. And so now when I go back to here, I take my hello world script and I drag it over to the main camera and I cross my fingers and see what happens. So what I'm hoping has happened is that there's a script now attached to the main camera, and that is the case. So make sure that your main camera is highlighted here. And then what we've basically done is we're starting to understand the workflow of adding things to Unity that we want to happen inside of our game scene in this space, right? So hello world, we've attached that script to the main camera. And over here, you'll see that that script has now been attached in the inspector. In Unity, the inspector is going to show the properties for the item that is highlighted inside of the scene inspector here, or the scene panel, right? So when I have, I also have directional light. Watch what happens when I click directional light. Directional light is now what is being listed over here in the inspector. So this is all dependent on which item you are currently focused on within the editor. Okay, so now that we have a script that's attached to this, we're going to pay attention down here to our console. This is where our print statement is going to show us that things are working right. Okay, so I hit play and things start to happen. And down here, you'll see very low, down in here, you'll see, I've actually brought that up to be full screen, but it shows hello world. And so that's all that code does. It's nothing special, but it certainly helps us to understand how things go in Unity. Now, this is another one of those instances where I'm glad we saw things happening in real time, because what you can do if you get that panel coming up and you can't get it to go away or anything like that, I'm going to hit save on this scene so I can make sure that things are taken care of there. Um, you'll hit play and then you'll hit play again to stop the recording. But if you ever get to a point where you think things are missing, then you can find your layout menu and just go back to your game dev highlight. So that's our first program, and here we are with Hello World printing out into the control area. But lest you think you're done, we have one more thing to look at. So let's go back into our Hello World script. I'll double click on that. It brings it up here. And in the next section of the chapter, Gibson Bond goes in and takes print world or print Hello World out of the start area and puts it into the update area. And so I'm going to click save on this and hit save on this. I'm just using my keyboard shortcut of Command S to hit save. You'll want to get used to your keyboard shortcuts. But now I come back over here and I already have my script attached to the main camera, so I don't have to reattach the script. It's going to read that new every time. But what I have done is I now have my script that's going to be coming up over here. You'll notice too that I have an error message that says there are inconsistent line endings in this script, and that might lead to incorrect line numbers and stack traces and compile errors and things like that. So what I'm going to do is come back over to here, and I just want to take a look at why it might have told me that. I don't know why it might have told me that, but so we're going to run it and see what happens. I'm going to hit play, and you'll notice that now, as long as it's in the update screen, that Hello World is going to print out for us at an astronomical rate. It should be going at roughly, I don't know. It's going very fast, at least 15 frames per second, and it's probably not showing as many updates as it needs to. So we're going to hit stop on that. That will stop the reporting of that item. But what this console allows you to do is it allows you to see what's happening in real time with your program. So I think it's really beneficial to at least get an exposure to what's happening in that space. You want to watch that area closely to see what the errors are. And you once you've used it and you're done with testing whatever it is, you can just hit clear, and that'll clear out all of your previous error messages or your console messages as needed. Okay, now 2 additional little tips that he shares in the chapter. If you're in your Hello World script, one of the things that he did was he commented out this line from above. So this line was actually listed here, and he used that / for a comment. And what that does, it allows you to comment out some code. It tells the compiler to basically ignore that code, right? And so you ignore that code, you move on to the next bit of code that it needs to interpret or it needs to run through. Okay, so there's that, and then here whenever we were running this, I hit play, and you have all of these items that are coming up. And if it's the same line over and over again, if you click on collapse, what that'll collapse is each message down, and you'll just see the running update of how many times that message has been shown. So it cleans up the console for you pretty significantly. All right, so the next step is to create some game objects here, and I'm really excited to see how this is going to work for us. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what we're going to be making. We're going to be making a shape. We're going to be making a 3D shape and 3D space in Unity, and we're going to work with a scripting language that helps us to do things with that particular item. All right. So I'll switch back to my view here, and I'm going to switch back to the chapter to get a little bit more detail on things. So first thing I want to do is to go to File and New Scene from the menu bar. And I'm going to go over here and go to File. I'm going to go to New Scene. All right, and this is a brand new scene, but you notice that all of my assets are over here. And because I haven't saved it yet, it's not going to show up in my scenes under assets until I do that. And so what I'm going to do is change this, and I'm going to use his naming this time. Shame on me, I didn't use it the first time, but it was just a basic script. So I'm going to name this one scene _scene_1. So I'm going to do save scene as, and that was a right click on that. I'm going to do _scene_1. Okay. And I just want to make sure that I'm doing that the right way, so I don't deviate from what the tutorial is doing. So _scene_1. I click save, and now that scene is going to show up here under my assets, right? And it shows up outside of the original scene folder. We want to make sure that we keep things organized, but we'll get to that later. The next step is to choose the game object that we want to use. And so we're going to make a game object, a 3D object, and that's going to be a cube. And we're going to name that guy cube. And we're going to make sure that it's in the scene pane, excuse me, and the hierarchy pane. And let's have some fun with this. So I'm going to go back into Unity. I'm going to create a game object. I'm going to do a 3D object. I'm going to click on cube. And so there's my cube. Here he is. It's right in there. And it's called cube right now. So we'll just leave it that way as we go. All right. And let's take a look at some of the properties that it has available for us. Okay. So we created a cube. I'm going to save this scene with the cube in it. And notice over here on the inspector, I've got a cube named cube. And right now it has it's untagged and it's on a default layer. And so we have tagging capability and layering capabilities over here in the inspector. The next thing that we'll see is the transform properties here. And these are really important in terms of knowing where you are in 3D space. So in 3D space, we have an X, we have a Y, and we have a Z. And they have a corresponding corresponding colors in the interface based on their position. So red is moving in the X direction, Y is moving the Y direction up and down, and so if you think about it, you're looking at like a 2D plane here, and then the Z depth is going to be the blue direction here. So X is typically moving in the flat pane direction, and if we want to make a pane and have it align, we're going to align the X with the Z in the interface. If we want things to go up and down, that's going to be our Y positioning. And so we have the green node here that we can use to modify that stuff. But this panel is really important because we can modify all of those properties by number, and doing things by number is much more consistent. Okay. Next, we have the type of filter that goes around the cube. So this is a really important distinction, and I want to make sure that we get it right now, just as a concept. The object is the graphic, right? The mesh filter that surrounds it is are the polygons that make up that object. So what we see represented here is a gray cube. What the computer is really rendering is a bunch of polygons that make this shape. Now, for a simple cube, it's going to be a polygon in the shape of a square. So we have essentially 6 squares on this. So if you think of a modern pair of dice, or one die, you might be looking at something like that. Now, there are different types of meshes, and I'm not going to get into those right now, but for each mesh, there's also a mesh renderer. And that mesh renderer allows us to customize how that thing is going to show on screen. The details of this will become evident as you move forward, but the mesh renderer allows us to play with shading and light and dynamics with the visual aspects of how this mesh is actually rendered on screen. Okay, so does, for example, this material cast shadows on anything else that it's underneath, for example? Okay. The next thing that we see is a box collider, and a collider is by default attached to this cube, and that box allows us to notice when one object hits another object. That's what a collider is. And so if I had a second object in this space that hit into this object, it would allow us to do something with it, right? If there's a collider on it, then it shouldn't overlap. It shouldn't pass through necessarily. But that is not always the case. There are other settings that we have to add in to make sure that that stays consistent. All right. So this is where you go to look for those sorts of things. You also have materials that you can add to the box, and right now it's just a default shader on there. It's a little gray shader. And then we have the add components button that allows us to add all sorts of different components here. And so let me switch to a view where it's not my face, and you can see all of the things that come about whenever we click on the add component item. All right. So when I clicked on add component, I'm somehow, let's see, on the cube. All right. So when I clicked on add component, I think I inadvertently ended up searching for something, but there are all of these different components, and feel free to explore these. I mean, just start up this scratchy little project and just have fun throwing things at it and see what happens. Sometimes that's the best way to figure out how things are going. But you can see from the list, you have AR options, audio, effects, 2D and 3D physics, things that are playable, rendering items, tile maps if you're doing a tile-based layout, where you have to keep track of which tile something's on, like a game board, for example. User interface stuff, XR stuff, video. There's all sorts of options you can add in terms of the components down here. So for what it's worth, we have added a cube in here, and now we're going to go on to the next step as prescribed by Jeremy Gibson Bond. I would encourage you to read through all of these. I'm going through this as a tutorial just to make sure that you can see how things are at work in this particular space. But check out what happens. So if I go back into Unity and I hit play, what happens? Nothing happens, right? All right. Now, if I go in and do an add components, and I add in, I'm going to type in rigid body in here, and click on rigid body. All right, so that's going to add down here below. Oops, I forgot that my big head is going to be in the way, so let's change that out. So I'm going to twirl down camera, I'm going to twirl down physics 2D here, and I'm going to pay attention to where it says rigid body. All right. So once I've added a rigid body to this now gives that object mass and gives us some other physical properties to it. Otherwise, it's just a box that stays in place. So once I hit play, I see that box start to fall from the sky. Okay. So now it is affected by gravity because I've added rigid body on here. All right. So as to keep going forward and not back up, you can always rewind to go back and see what I did there, but I'll review it here. So what I did was I went to add component, and because I knew I wanted to look for a rigid body, I started typing in rigid body. And you might ask, well, what if I don't know that I'm supposed to add a rigid body, right? Well, if I'm looking for rigid body in a list of items, it's fairly common, so you probably wouldn't need to, but it should be under the physics area. So you have different colliders, and you have rigid body on here as well. You also have some spring joints and other types of things that you can bring in from the physical perspective. So those things are going to be available for you from menus, and you should be all set to go there. All right, so the next step here is to consider what we're doing whenever we're looking at the physical simulations. It's really important to note that 1 unit of distance is equivalent to 1 meter in actual meat space. So if you're trying to do things in in terms of direct proportions to what is happening in the real world, you can use these conversions. So when 1 unit of mass is 1 kilogram, the default measurement of gravity is the same as the default measurement of gravity in all of physics. So what it says here is an average human character is about 2 units or 2 meters tall. And so, but it gives us a nice conversion system, and thank goodness for the metric system, and it's not the imperial system. We don't have to deal with doing math on feet and miles and things like that. So if you are simulating an English system, you do have to have those conversions available for you and at the ready. So the next thing that we need to do is to, once we have an object that has the right characteristics for us, we're going to turn that into a prefab. And a prefab is just something that we can grab off the shelf, and it has all the characteristics we want it to have. So I'm going to switch back over to Unity here. And once I have done that, I've got my cube available here in scene 1. And I'm going to make sure that I'm following what he's suggesting here. I'm going to pull that right into the project window. And I'm going to take this cube, and you'll notice 2 things happening. One, once I drag this over to here, I'm going to actually put it in the assets folder just because. Once that happens, then you'll see that this cube now becomes what's called an instance of this prefab over here. So a prefab is an object that we can use over and over again. And then this item here is going to be one instance of that particular prefab, right? And then whenever I go into that little arrow over here, it gives me a close-up look at that particular prefab. I can change things around based on what I want this thing to actually look like in the scene. And so I can navigate back and forth in the hierarchy in this space as well. It's a lot to get used to, so if you feel like you're not quite getting it just yet, don't worry. We're going to get lots of practice with this stuff, especially in our first big tutorial, which is going to be the apple picker tutorial in this book. All right, so now, once I have a prefab, I'm going to rename this to be a cube prefab. I'm going to say cube prefab, right? And I believe that's exactly what he wanted me to call it. Oh, with a space. We don't need to worry about that. So once I have a cube prefab, this is kind of cool. Now I have this cube that I can use over and over again. And he also instructs us that we don't need this in our scene for the next step. So I'm going to go over to here, and I'm going to right-click over here and delete this guy. So I have this prefab, and I have a script. Now the magic happens here whenever you combine the two items, all right? So now what I'm going to do is step 3 here. And I tell you what, y'all, this is so much fun. So I'm going to go into assets and create in Csharp script from the menu, and then I'm going to name this cube spawner. All right. So we're going to make a bunch of cubes spawn on the screen, right? So I'm going to go to create. I'm going to go to Csharp script. It has a new behavior script, and I'm going to call this cube spawner. Okay. And I'm going to hit enter on this. And now that I have hit enter, that means that the names are going to match up. I'll double click on this, and I get the same basic default item that you might see in my editor. And I do apologize for the little typo there, but whenever you're typing in here, make sure that you're paying attention to where exactly you're placing things, because it is very, very strict about where you need to put your code in this editor. So if you want it to work, it's got to be inside start or update, depending on whether you want it to be called on the first frame update or called once per frame. Okay. So now I'm going to go back to the book, and we're going to take a look at the code, and let's double check to make sure that I have everything the right way here. All right. So I'm going to go into my cube spawner, right? And then I'm going to add in this line, public game object cube prefab var. Okay, don't worry that sounds like gibberish, right? It does sound a little bit like gibberish. But I want to make sure that I'm in the right place, so I'm going to put that up here. I'm going to say public game object. Did I say that right? Game object. right? And in here, I'm going to call this cube prefab var, okay? Which we're using as a shorthand for a cube prefab variable. Right? And then down here in the start, I'm going to call for a thing called instantiate. I'm going to say instantiate cube prefab var. Okay. What that means is, okay, Unity, get ready. We're going to have a game object, and we're going to call it cube prefab var. And in here, in this code, you're going to do fun things with it. Like, that's basically what we're telling the computer to do here so far. Okay? So now I have to know if you like chaos. I'm sure you like chaos. So when I have chosen instantiate cube prefab var, I'm getting this little error here, and it basically says, like, I'm not really sure exactly what you're trying to tell me here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just kind of ignore this for a second to make sure that things work how I want them to. Okay. So I'm going to go back into my Unity, and what I do here is under cube spawner, I just want to make sure that I show you where we are in the code here. Okay. So in the main camera, we're going to add cube spawner to that. So I'm actually, it was on step 5 where we want to add that to the main camera. But on step 6, you'll see where it actually shows up. So I'm going to take cube spawner, drag it over to main camera, and I hit save. I click on main camera, and you'll notice that cube spawner is existing over here as the script in this space. And what it's claiming is that there should be a cube prefab var that shows up here as a game object, and I'm not seeing it, so I will rejoin you in just 1 second to make sure that my code looks right. All right, so I'm over here, and I say public game object cube prefab var. Right? And what I'm supposed to see, public game object cube prefab var. And down here, I'm calling instantiate and cube prefab var down there. Okay. Make sure that's saved. I have my cube spawner over here. And what I should be seeing over here is a variable that shows up. But it's giving me an error, and it says a namespace cannot directly contain members such as fields or methods. So there is a chance that we're doing something just a little bit not quite right. So I'm going to hit pause and figure that out. And just as soon as I thought about it, that's what the error messages are great for. As soon as you see those error messages, you know the computer's right and I'm not right. So where we actually want to put this is we want to put this inside here, somewhere inside the public class cube spawner. Because if it's not inside here, if it's not inside all of that stuff, then we don't get a chance to actually see it over here in our script. So what I'm going to do is go back into Unity. I'm going to go back into my main camera, and I'm going to make sure that cube spawner is attached to here. If you drag and drop again, it's going to attach it twice. We don't want that to happen. So we're going to remove that component over there. We always want to have one component. And I caution you that sometimes when I do make mistakes, it's not I'm not trying to trick you or anything like that. I'm just making sure that you see how to get out of those mistakes, because these things are going to happen at the beginner level for you as well. So now we have a cube prefab var, and there's nothing attached to it just yet. And we're going to go back over to our tutorial. We have the game object that is not linked, but you see a little little guy that allows us to make a connection. And then so we have step 7. As you can see in the inspector, cube prefab var currently has no value assigned. And then it says click the circular target to the right of cube prefab var to open the select game object dialog box, from which you can select the prefab to assign the variable. Okay, so what I'm going to do is going to take this and I click that. It gives me this little window. It says select game object. I want to go into the assets panel and I want to click on cube prefab, and this is the game object I want to see here. Okay. So this menu showed up in a weird space for me, and it might not show up exactly where you expect it to, but once you have it in place, you have this linkage of the cube prefab as the object to this as the variable inside the script, right? So inside the script, now we can do stuff with this. We can make the cube show up on the screen. So I'm going to hit play. And what I should see is that one object shows up and drops down, because as we know, and I tried to exit without stopping. So as we know, and I'm going to hit save on this as well, as we know, cube spawner has our script only in the start area, right? So look what happens when we take that instantiate and we move it down to the update area. And y'all, this is too much fun. So I hit play, and there they go. We've got cubes flying everywhere, and what a delight this is. All right, so check out what else is happening. The more these spawn, the slower it gets. The more these spawn, we have different cube prefabs that show up over here. Every time a new one is added, it's added to a grouping called an array, and that array of objects has a number to it. So the first one is going to be number 0. The second one is going to be number 1. The third one's going to be number 2, and so on and so forth. So we can actually address each one of these individual random items by their numeric value as well. All right, it's very wild. And if your computer at some point crashes because of this, then I'm sorry. I apologize, but it's too much fun to actually see those guys explode, right? So I'm just gonna hit stop on that as soon as that starts going, and we can kind of wrap up the that aspect of it. So now we have the spawner that shoots all these cubes around. Okay. Now, we did the switch to make it instantiate. And then we had the cube spawner, and there's a lot of things happening. So now, what we're going to do is we're going to go through this next little step. So in the hierarchy, we're going to click the Create pop-up menu and choose 3D Object Cube, and we're going to name the cube to ground. Right. So now we're going. You know, we had all these things that were falling off, and now what we're going to do is create a new game object, 3D Object Cube. And we're going to rename this to ground, right? So when we create a new object, it wants to put it into the scene that we're on, and this is going to be another instance where we're going to have to arrange a few things here. So now, the third thing, with the ground object selected in the scene pane or hierarchy pane, press the W, E, or R to translate, move, rotate, or scale the game object. Okay. So take a look at this screen. Q is the hand. It moves things around. W is directional. E rotates. R expands, and T is going to position things in 2D and for GUI objects and things like that. So we have a mix of 3D and 2D, even in a 3D area. So let's go back into Unity. I'm going to hit Q on the keyboard, and that changes this to a view where we have the hand, and we can move this around in space. When we move this around in space, we're actually moving the scene around. When I click W, this is going to allow us to manipulate the positioning of the object. And if you pay close attention to what's happening in your transform window, all these values are changing as we go. So I'm just gonna show you that you can move this around by object. You can also move on axis if you are on the W window. If you do E, this allows us to rotate this box in different directions. And so I'm just going to rotate this a little bit, and you can see the rotation around the different axes. So you want to try and be as particular as possible when you're clicking a line to rotate things, and you can move your things around in real time. I'm going to click on the object, click on R. If I type R, what R allows me to do is to change the shape of this object, and so that's going to be important later, but that is to basically reshape this thing. And then my T allows me to do things with the 2D plane. I'm not going to do that. So whenever I'm saying Q, W, E, R, and T, what I'm actually doing is controlling this menu up here in the top left-hand corner. So Q, W, E, R, T, and Y. Well, Y is the last one. It does sort of the mega tool, but I'm going to go back to my Q. I'm going to leave it set on Q. I'm going to save this scene. I'm going to go back into position, and I'm going to zero out my values in rotation and my scale. I'm going to make this 1, 1, and 1. Okay. So we have positions all 0, rotations all 0, and the scale is all 1. So we have this zeroed out. And it was fun to kind of play around with that stuff, but we really do want to be precise. So once we have settled on a measurement here, we are going to change the position, rotation, and scale manually. And bear with me for 1 second, because I'm going to take a look at this. So P is going to be 0. We take -4. Remember, we're working on the ground, right? So the ground is going to be down below our spawning object, right? So position 0, -4, and 0. And then we're going to change the scale of this to 10 on the x-axis, 1 on the y-axis, and then 10 again on the x-axis. So now we have essentially a nice little floor essentially for our object. Okay. So this is ground. Ground's available for us, and the next step is going to be coming right up. And so the next step is to hit play and check out what happens. All right. So we have this ground in place. It's part of our scene. We don't want it to be a prefab. We don't need it to be dynamic. But then what happens? Now we have the effects of gravity happening. So I'm going to zoom out on this a little bit. Actually, I'm going to have to hit pause because it's running very slowly now. But you kind of got to get a sense for what is happening in that space, right? So so we have our ground here, and we have our scene, and then we have our display on here. And if we take the scale all the way down to 0, we can see how things are going to work on different screens, sizes down here and everything. So I'll hit play once again, and you can see the box is coming into the screen, and there goes the interface. So lots of fun. All right, the author also adds some tips in here in terms of changing the scene view. So if we're using Q, we can left click, right click, left drag, right drag. We can also hold down the Option key or the Alt key on a PC. We can also scroll with the scroll wheel on a mouse for zooming in and out. And you can also zoom by Option and right dragging in the scene pane. And so when we were in here working on this, I'm going to hold down Option and right click, and that's going to zoom me out here. And same thing in terms of this, when we hit play, now we can see a better idea of what's happening with our different objects and that floor that's catching things. So you could do a few things here. You could add different objects in here, different things that things could collide to. Put another wall over here and see what happens whenever things reflect off the wall and that sort of thing. So you can have some fun with that stuff. If you want to, you could also duplicate the ground, and we could make this a wall. Let's play around with this as a second idea, and this time we'll make it 10 and 10 and 1, and so now this is a wall, and I'm going to use this the positioning here. So I'm going to use the move tool, and I'm just going to position this over to the side here to see what happens whenever things bounce off the wall. So I'll hit play, and here comes my colliders. And I didn't get anything shooting off to the side just yet, and it looks like it's going right past it because we're not quite in line. So so working in 3D space can be a little bit of a challenge here. I'm going to move this over to here so that it's more in line with things, and I'm going to hit play again, and let's see if that collision is going to now work. It goes right past it. How about that? It takes some messing around to get things exactly how you want them to be, but it looks like we're missing something in how that thing is reflecting off of there. I don't know. I'll play around with it and see what happens. But for now, that helps to get us through chapter 19. You got introduced to Unity. You get a chance to see how things are working. It was clocked in a little bit under an hour, and hopefully this helped to keep you in line with the chapter. So take care. We'll talk to you soon.